All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining from across the world. We have New Yorkers in the house. We have people from California and all over Australia. It's fantastic to have you all tuning in. And yes, I'm looking forward to sharing this knowledge with you. We're going to go on a bit of a journey together here. I'm going to take you deep into this practice, this knowledge, so you have a full kind of understanding of what Vastu is all about. And you'll take a few things away from this talk today. One, what you can do to bring the Vastu effect into your current home or place of business. And then I'm also going to give you a vision for the future. I'll give you a vision for the future that hopefully you'll be able to partake in at some point. We've got a couple more people joining in here. And if you could just double check to make sure you're on mute while I take you through this little journey we'll go on, and we'll have plenty of time for some Q&A at the end. So welcome. Vastu architecture is all about creating space for communities to thrive. And earlier this year, I created Well Design Co. to not only educate people, but also bring the designing and building of Vastu art and architecture to the world in a bigger way for the purpose of uplifting all humanity for collective well-being. And so with Vastu architecture being at the core of it, we're also looking to collaborate with a number of people in the wellness space and regenerative food systems to create a new model for sustainable living. This is one of my projects just to give you a taste of what a modern application of Vastu can look and feel like. A lot of people think initially Vastu is maybe an Indian style of architecture or something of that nature, and it's a little bit more universal than that. So I wanted to kind of give you a sense of what's possible. And we'll go into what makes a Vastu space compliant, what those principles are. And I want to give you a little bit of background so you understand why I'm here and how I got into this. So I have an engineering background as well as Vedic meditation background. And the two sort of merged together with this Vastu education that I received from Dr. Jessie, who is the chancellor of the American University of Maionic Science and Technology, which was founded by Dr. Ganapati Sthapati, who's a world-renowned Vastu architect. Based in Tamil Nadu, southern India. And so this is my teacher, Dr. Jessie, and she studied very closely with Dr. Ganapati Sthapati, and she was a transcendental meditation teacher for many decades and explored spirituality in every facet you could think of, many different traditions and different areas. And it wasn't until she finally found Vastu that everything clicked into place and the search was over. And so she was called to bring this wisdom to the West by Dr. Ganapati Sthapati, and has this really great program. It's a 2-year program to become a Vastu consultant, which I graduated from last summer. This is some of the work of Dr. Jessie. She's built dozens and dozens of homes and businesses throughout the Americas, in Montana, in Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona. And she's currently working on a pretty amazing project in northern Mexico. This is her teacher, Dr. Ganapati Sthapati, and he's a world-renowned architect with high honors and contributions, was an educator and author as well on the subject. And he built hundreds and hundreds of temples all throughout India and around the world. And he made some incredible statues as well, all Vastu compliant. This is some of his work. This statue on the left side is at the most southern tip of India at a place called Kanyakumari. It's a colossal statue of Saint Tiruvalluvar, which is a famous Tamil poet. And it's about 133 feet in height and is made 100% out of stone. It's the largest solely stone statue in the world. It was completed in January 2000. And I believe it was in 2003, there was that earthquake and tsunami that wiped out the southern area of India, and the statue withstood that. In the center here, we have this beautiful temple located in the island of Kauai in Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands, that was designed and built by Dr. Sthapati, and as well as this temple here on the right side, which is in Washington, D.C. So before we dive into Vastu, I want to just take a moment for us to reflect on our current relationship with space. How does this space make you feel? Maybe if you want, you can, sit back, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and just tune into that inquiry. How does the space, maybe the space you're in right now, make you feel? What are the various qualities of that space that you believe are attributing to these sensations you're feeling? How would you describe these qualities? What about the room or building that you're in do you think is contributing to this? So with that little reflection, I want to talk about what these influences are. The first one is pretty obvious, right? Aesthetics. Lighting, color, scent, air quality, temperature, acoustics, the type of furniture, if there's any greenery, the types of materials that are being used, certainly attribute to our sensory experience of a space, as well as the functionality, right? What's the layout like? What's the intended use of the space? What's the culture around it? What are the inhabitants like if it's a shared space? People's vibes have an influence as well. And then the measurements, right? What's the room size, the ceiling height? Those also feel different depending on the measurement. And then the location, right? Where is this building located? What is the environment like around it? What's the land quality like? What's the climate, the seasons? And then spiritual ambiance. This one, most people don't consider. There's a subtle energy in space as well that is impacting our thoughts and feelings and well-being on a much subtler level. So that's what we're going to start diving into with Vastu. Vastu considers all of it, and it includes the spiritual ambiance, which goes missing in a lot of design. And I also want to review what is our current landscape within the field of architecture, right? It's good to understand where we're at so we can understand where we can go and how Vastu can impact what we create in the future. So currently we're seeing a number of things, a lot of fast architecture, especially in more urban areas, lots of high rises, cities like New York, Los Angeles, I imagine in Sydney and Melbourne as well. It's driven by this consumer culture, right? It's driven by financial gain primarily. And we also see a lot of deconstructive design. Frank Gehry's a prime example of that, which certainly, draws attention and is fascinating and much more sculptural and artistic in its presence. But that deconstructive design is not all of that practical, and not everyone particularly resonates with it. We also see this trend in energy efficiency thanks to LEED from the US Green Building Council and their efforts to make things carbon neutral or net zero. And that's been around for a few decades now. it still has a way to go, but it's making some efforts to reduce greenhouse gases caused by buildings. And then we also see human health being considered more now. In the last 5 to 7 years, there's been a new initiative called the Well Building Standard that looks at similar principles to LEED, but it's focused around the health of the inhabitants. And it's focused on, more scientifically driven variables, and can be applied to existing spaces primarily for office use and things like that. So that's great that that's coming about as well and gaining popularity, as well as integrated technology. So there's a lot of electronic integration happening where we can control our lighting and appliances through our phone and unlock our doors that way, that sort of thing. Although we're still missing a lot of important things. Because of this nature of fast-paced architecture, we're losing craftsmanship for quality and ultimately longevity. And so a lot of these buildings are having to be fixed a lot of time, the maintenance costs go up, and actually, we're not actually saving energy or money in the long run. And then symmetry and orderliness for balance and stability is also missing in a lot of new construction, and symmetry and orderliness, brings about balance and stability. So it's really important that we kind of come back to some of these original principles in our designs. And spiritual ambience, which I mentioned, is not really considered at all in architecture in most cases, and Vastu very much brings that into the equation. We also need to look at decarbonization and decolonization for environmental and social justice. This is very important and a huge topic that's going to require a number of experts to come in and really come up with a good game plan. And I believe Vastu can be an important component to that. And because the way in which we design spaces impacts how our culture functions, and our spaces are currently designed as a reflection of our culture. So the two can go hand in hand. I think we can have them work together in that way. And conscious city planning sort of goes with point 4, which is really focusing design around earth-centered thinking, right, for collective well-being. And so this is Well Design's mission, is to really bring all of this together. So let's get into it. What is Vastu? Where does it come from? First, we need to know what it's not. Unfortunately, in today's world, with all this access to information, there is a tremendous amount of misinformation online. You Google Vastu, you're not going to get really the clear picture of it. So when I first heard about Vastu, I just immediately thought, oh, it must be like the Indian version of Feng Shui. And that's actually not the case. Feng Shui means wind and water, which was actually derived from a larger body of knowledge known as Kanyu, which essentially is the Chinese form of Vastu. Kanyu means heaven and earth. And Kanyu traces its roots back to India, where Vastu originally came from. So Feng Shui originally birthed from Vastu long ago. Vastu is also not, traditional Vastu is not contemporary Vastu. Contemporary Vastu is sort of piecemeal knowledge of Vastu and then reinterpreted in a new way to attempt to rectify existing spaces in a way that's actually not really beneficial or potentially harmful. So it's important to be aware of that, not to be discerning in the type of Vastu you get involved with, because not all of it is legitimate. Traditional Vastu goes much deeper, and I'm going to dive into that with you in a moment. Astrology, Vastu is not it's not rooted in the astrological events. So, you might hear that a certain temple was designed so that the sunrise or the equinox aligns with it in a certain way. All of that is actually just from, observance and speculation, but it's not the source of Vastu. It's sort of just an outcome of perhaps some of the building. And then the last thing is that the style is actually universal, like the principles are universal. So it's not specifically Indian style of architecture, although of course we very much, trace the roots to India and honor, that spiritual heritage, because they, the people of India have preserved this for thousands of years. So we are very much indebted to them for that. And yes, so continuing onward, what is Vastu? We need to clarify some terminology. So there's two terms of Vastu. You'll see it spelled with one A and you'll see it spelled with two A's. Vastu with one A, pronounced Vastu, a short A, is that eternal energy force that is omnipresent. So the etymology you can see here is to live eternally. It's to cause, to shine, to dwell, becoming light. And so when we talk about Vastu science, we're talking about the technical process that describes how primal potential energy manifests into matter and form. And this very much coincides with quantum field theory, and a lot of modern science is pointing in the same direction that Vastu has been pointing towards for thousands of years. And then Vastu with two A's, the long A Vastu, is this Vastu in its full material form. And so the root is to make fragrant or to perfume. It's an intoxicant. It's the dwelling place or to assume the appearance of matter. So we apply this term to Vastu technology, which is the application of Vastu. And so it's the energetic effect created in space and time when these specific mathematical formulas of the Vastu science are applied through one of 5 art forms. It's not only architecture, but it's also sculpture, dance, music, and poetry. We focus on the architecture, particularly because it is seen almost like as frozen music, right? Music can be incredibly uplifting and can change the way you feel, and eventually the song comes to an end, right? So it's short-lived. Whereas the architectural form lasts for hundreds of years, and that resonance from the form itself stays with us. And because of the scale, it's more impactful than a sculpture, although sculpture has resonance as well when it's Vastu compliant. So Vastu architecture specifically is when all the mathematical formulas of Vastu are applied so that the space it contains begins to resonate with this spiritual ambiance that uplifts the inhabitants from the inside out. It's not just aesthetically pleasing and very practical in its design, but it also has that effect of uplifting well-being. So to understand Vastu on a bit of a deeper level, we have to understand some of the basic principles of the Vastu Vedic worldview, which I think many of you are probably already very familiar with. So consciousness, essentially, from the Vastu Vedic perspective, is everything. A lot of wisdom traditions around the world would agree with this notion. I am that, you are that, everything is nothing but that. And within this totality, consciousness manifests all qualities, not just, the good and the blissful things, but also the bad, the ugly, and the sublime, all of it. And we see that from a unified field of unbounded awareness manifests this creation, which then maintains itself and then eventually destroys itself, so then it can create again. So we see this cycle of manifestation occurring, creating this multiplicity and an appearance of duality within oneness. So knowing that, just as a foundation, as the nature of consciousness, we can then begin to understand this fundamental, essential root of Vastu. It's Anoranyam Mahato Mahyan Atman Bruhayam Ihito Sajantoho. And the saying comes from one of the ancient texts, the Upanishads, meaning subtler than the subtlest and greater than the greatest. The Atman is concealed in the heart of all creatures. This eternal Atman is a direct replica of the cosmic Atman. This will begin to make sense in the next few slides. So I love this quote by Tesla. You know, we really need to think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration to take our modern science to another level. And there's a belief that modern science and this ancient knowledge will at some point come together. And so, yeah, we can think in terms of that. And when we're open to considering the nature of consciousness in that way, then we're able to start understanding Vastu in a much clearer way. And I'm going to let this animation start over for a minute here. This is the manifestation process unfolding. It's called Vastu Reva Vastu. It's on the most subtle level of consciousness. And this is how it's described in all of the Vastu texts. So it's this pulse of energy that breaks the symmetry of this unified field and begins to spin onto itself, unfolding again and again in a clockwise fashion, creating this 8x8 grid. And then it folds onto itself again and again, becoming an octagonal, circular, and then pushing out another level of grid, creating this 9x9 Vastu Purusha mandala. This mandala is the foundation of Vastu design. And you can see here within the Vastu Purusha mandala, all of the 5 subtle elements settle within that 9x9 grid or 8x8 grid, depending on the type of structure. And the location of those elements help indicate and influence the layout of the design, which I'll describe in a moment. So what is Vastu really doing? Well, it's creating this resonant harmony within the contained space. When the Vastu mathematics are not applied to architecture, then the energy within the space becomes highly unpredictable. We don't know what the qualities are arising from the earth and the cosmic energy in the atmosphere. There's no way to really know. And so it can cause this dissonance to occur and create stress in the atmosphere, which impacts stress in our body. So what Vastu does is it creates order. It creates orderly energy, both cosmic energy and earthly energy. And the contained space is where the two meet and commingle. And within that contained space is where that unfolding occurs in a clockwise fashion. And all the elements settle within the space. And so it causes the frequency within ourselves, known as the Jeev Atman, it has a resonance. Our soul essentially has some form of frequency, and the frequency within the contained space causes the frequency within our Atman to begin resonating with it. And it creates this harmonious effect known as bhakti. And what is bhakti? I'm sure many of us have heard that word before. You might think of it as, devotion or love of a teacher, but it actually has a deeper meaning than that, a more technical one. And so bhakti is the self unfolding itself for the self by itself. It refers to this luminous beam of light that resonates cosmically. And the Vastu structure causes that frequency to resonate in space so that inhabitants within the space begin to be uplifted from within. And so bhakti, we see the etymology here, and it's referring more to to this movement of energy and frequency coming together and resonating in harmony. Brahma Rishi Mayan, this is one of my favorite quotes from him, found in one of the ancient texts. Brahma Rishi Mayan is the progenitor of Vastu from thousands and thousands of years ago. And he's the one who cognized a lot of this, this wisdom, and people began applying it since ancient times. The oldest record of where this comes from is in Southern Asia, actually south. It's predicted to be southeast of India, present-day India, in sort of the Indonesia area. Back when the Ice Age caused the sea levels to be much lower, there was much more landmass there, and there was an entire culture that was practicing Vastu in that area, and then eventually made its way to what we call modern-day India, that region of the world. And it's in that location that it's been preserved for the last 5,000 years. So they're the custodians of this wisdom. And it has been applied, worldwide since ancient times. But it's this tradition of the Vishwakarma Brahmin lineage that has really kept it intact. So we really have them to thank for this. And you'll hear the term Sthapati. Sthapati is basically a Vastu architect, builder, designer, sculptor. And they're responsible for bringing this to the world. We are fortunately moving through a reemergence now, through globalization and our communication with different cultures around the world. We're able to access this knowledge and study with great masters to bring this to different parts of the world. So that's what happened with Dr. Jessie and Dr. Sthapati. And we look at a few different things to verify and validate this, right? It doesn't work on the level of belief, but we want to, come to this with some curiosity and skepticism to validate whether or not this stuff is really true. At least that's how I like to approach things. And so not only can we verify this knowledge because of this traditional Sthapati family, but also we look at all the historical records and the sacred texts, and we cross-reference them to make sure that they're congruent. And my teacher makes us read them all. It's a lot of work. We also have to validate archaeological evidence, right? We look at existing spaces around the world and we see, where the principles are true and see if there's still effect there. And then we have technical experience, where we actually do these projects and build them. And I've worked on 6 of them in the last year, and it's pretty remarkable. So historical texts, there's over 12 million stanzas to look at. So a lot of knowledge. And, Dr. Sthapati spent his whole life working on this, and Dr. Jessie the last few decades very deeply studying all of this wisdom and bringing out these pearls of wisdom to make the traditional knowledge more applicable and correct. So some people wonder, is Vastu Vedic knowledge? It is. It's actually a lot of the origin of Vastu knowledge when you trace back the text far enough, which is quite fascinating. Archaeological evidence, we see, lots of sites throughout the world where Vastu has influenced various cultures. The most potent Vastu energetic compliant spaces that I've experienced and that are to be said are in Tamil Nadu in southern India. There's this really wonderful temple tour that we take every other year in January, where you can go on this 2-week journey and you see over 24 temples, and you get to experience the various qualities of each one. And it's an incredible experience. Highly, highly recommend it. Yeah, it's quite fascinating. So, we see the Vastu influence around the world, the Great Pyramids of Egypt, Machu Picchu, the Taj Mahal, Mayan and Aztec pyramids in Mesoamerica, Angkor Wat, in Cambodia. A lot of these structures have been around for thousands of years. And so they're not quite as potent as they once were when they were first built, partly because there's an age to each Vastu structure, and eventually it expires and ages. And so the energy is not quite as vibrant. And also physically they begin to wear. And so the measurement is not quite as precise as it once was. So obviously for those of you who visit these places, I'm sure you could tell there was some kind of energy there. So you could imagine when it was first created, how much more vibrant it may have been. And direct experience, of course, is the last thing which I mentioned. It's really amazing participating in this kind of work, especially if you love getting your hands dirty and you enjoy building and designing in this kind of work. It's incredibly rewarding work. There's a whole process where we're designing very, specific measurements. And so when we build, we have to meet those measurements. And so we actually have a really fascinating methodology for actually getting the mark within a 64th of an inch. It's pretty fascinating. People think it's impossible to do, but we've managed to do it. Dr. Jessie's done it, dozens and dozens of buildings. And what's fascinating is that even going on these sites, I approached it with skepticism and just observed. And every time we build something, there's this response from nature that occurs. So every time, some examples, last summer, we were doing a building project in northern Mexico, and it was at the beginning of the build. So we had just laid out the foundation and poured the slab. The walls and the roof haven't even gone up. And we begin to lay out that 9x9 Vastu Purusha Mandala grid onto the slab so that we can determine where the walls will be going. And as soon as we finish that layout, the neighboring cows on the property, this is like a few hundred acres in northern Mexico in the forest, and there's some fields where there's a lot of cattle neighboring by. And for whatever reason, the cows decided to come through the gate. They made their way through, and they wanted to congregate and eat just right around where we were building. And they had acres and acres to graze elsewhere with, lots of green pasture. And no, they decided to graze right around us. I don't know how else to explain that. Maybe it's a coincidence. But in that same week, we also had this swarm of hundreds and hundreds of dragonflies roaming over the slab while we were working every sunrise and sunset for a week. And you would move away from the slab and there were no dragonflies anywhere. They were only congregating around the slab. We've seen storms come out of nowhere and just downpour, and rainbows come through as soon as we finish a piece of the construction. We've seen herds of goats come out of nowhere and graze around us. It's pretty fascinating. So how do we create this effect of heaven on earth through building architecture? There are four main design principles. The first is site selection. In site selection, we look at the land type, and the soil quality. There's a bunch of tests that we run on the soil. We look at the slope of the land and the flora and the fauna and the water flow, if there are any bodies of water nearby, and which direction they are, and if it's a river, like which direction it might be flowing, to make sure that when we create the Vastu effect, that everything around it is in harmony with the way in which that energy is moving. And so we can't build Vastu just quite anywhere, but we can do it. And the second thing is the measure. This is a super important piece of it that a lot of contemporary Vastu practitioners and consultants don't even know about. It's a missing piece from their body of knowledge. But this has been kept intact thanks to the Vishwa Karman lineage. It's known as Ayadi. And it turns out that the specific measure of the interior space determines specifically what qualities can be predicted that will arise within the space. And because, like I mentioned before, consciousness is totality, includes everything, the good, the bad, the ugly, and the sublime. It's also possible to have a building with a measure that's invoking qualities that are undesirable. And so this piece of Vastu mathematics is essential, because if you get the measurement off, even by a little amount, it can throw off the energy in a way that we don't want. So it sounds like a lot, it sounds very specific, but it's important, and you can do it. We've done it. And it's very rewarding when you get it. Then we have the orientation. Caroline, if you don't mind putting yourself on mute, that would be great. Thank you. The orientation is really important because the Earth has a grid to it that is in alignment with true north, not magnetic north, but true north. In this Earth grid, we want to be in alignment so that we're drawing that Vastu Purusha energy from the Earth in the proper way. And so we make sure that the orientation of the building is in such a way. And depending on where the entrance of the building is on one of the four sides, we orient it slightly in one way or another. We also need to look at layout, right? Because when we create the Vastu effect, this 9x9 grid has very specific energies that arise within each one of those squares. Those squares are known as padas. So there's an energetic quality within each one of those padas that we want to align with. You know, there's a pada that's beneficial for the kitchen and cooking. So we want to make sure that, you know, the food is being prepared within that pada, for example. There's another pada that helps with, you know, deeper sleep and with, you know, whoever's the owner or the authority of the house. You want to make sure the master bedroom is in that area. There's more spiritual energy in one part of the house, whereas where you would have your meditation, your yoga, your spiritual practice in that part of the house, and so on. So that's how we start determining the layouts, is by that.
Hunter, are you saying pada or padu?
Pada, P-A-D-A.
Thank you.
And ayadi, I want to extract that a little bit, the etymology of that term, which I think is quite fascinating. So aya means length or stretch. Ai means to search for. And adi means source. So ayadi means to search for the source through measure. So this is just a very simple example of a layout of a floor plan. This particular design is square in shape, but it can be rectangular. It could be stretched out. There's a way to do an L shape, a U shape, and also to have the central area as a courtyard. And these extensions that are coming off that sort of orange grid area can also be played with as well. So there's a lot of creativity that can be explored within the scope of the principles. And the two marry together very nicely. You can see that the 5 subtle elements are predicted in these various locations within the Vastu Purusha Mandala, with north, true north, being directly upward. And so the water element, you know, coincides with more of that heightened spiritual energy. And so that's where we do our meditation, our yoga. We can have an office there. We can, if we have elders in the home, we can have them living in that area. The central space, where the space element is called the Brahmastan. And this is always left open to honor that space element, because that's where the source of the energy is actually coming from. That's where the first commingling comes of the cosmic and earth energy. So commingles at the Bindu point in the center, and then begins to manifest in that clockwise fashion outward from the center. So we don't want to have a fountain or plants or things in the middle. Even though that might look appealing, it'll distort the energy. And so it creates for, usually, you know, that central space is opened up above with windows. So there's a lot of beautiful light pouring in, and it just lights up the whole house from the inside. If it's a large enough design, you can also create a courtyard. And the fire element is typically where the kitchen goes. Earth element is typically where the master bedroom goes. If it's multiple stories, you might have an office there on the first floor. There's a variety of different options. Air element, tends to lend towards, movement and feeling unsettled. So if you spend too much time in that space, you may want to leave the space after a while. So it's good for either like a guest bedroom or a media room or an office you use temporarily, these kinds of things, or living space. And, this is just a very basic design, just to give you a sense of how this works. But there are ways that this can be applied in more intricate ways to, multifamily units, apartment complexes, and larger buildings. So it's not just this simple, but it's where we like to start. So you just start to get a good sense of it. We also want to consider our building materials, right? So typically, the best way to harness that earth energy is to really have a solid slab in the earth and not to build up off the earth, which not a lot of people are used to in the West. It just depends on, what area of the world you live in. Different building practices are more common than others. I know in California, it's a lot of buildings built off of the ground with wood plank floors. And so concrete slab is a little bit different. And we do really great pours where there's no cracking, and it works really well. For the walls and the roof, you can use brick, wood framing. Hempcrete is a really fascinating material that's much more earth friendly. It's more regenerative, and it comes in these nice blocks, so it's really easy to build with. So it increases speed of building without sacrificing precision. And we don't want to use steel, so we avoid rebar, but you can use basalt rebar. This is rebar that's constructed and made using basalt stone instead of steel. Steel tends to hold energy. There's certain types of metals that hold energy, and that actually stagnates that flow of the Vastu effect. So we avoid that as much as possible. And when we're using, timber, we typically use, brass, screws and these kinds of things rather than other types of nails. You can use some metal, and depending on where you're building, there can be certain, codes and requirements that need to be followed as well. For natural disasters and things like that. So we find the middle ground and to make it work. And obviously, we always consider local materials so that we're reducing our carbon footprint in the building process. And then there's additional details that we consider in the finishing. Once the building's done and we're ready to paint, there's a specific color palette we use that's really, pleasing on the eye and really inviting, and that's always a nice bonus. Natural tones of reds, blue, green, yellow, black, and off-white are typically used traditionally. What's also really amazing is that permaculture and food forests marry Vastu beautifully. So that's a bonus. If you're bringing animals onto your land, then there's a specific location that they would go into the design. And same with town planning. We can apply this not just for, individuals and private homes and businesses, but we can apply it in a much larger scope as well. So these are a few more renderings that just give you another taste, another angle of what a Vastu space looks like now that you've had an introduction to it. As you can see, we have the Brahmastan there, nice and open with all that light pouring through, and a living and dining space, and kitchen off one wing and master bedroom off the next. Nice, simple, minimal, clean, warm, and inviting design. And you can really apply any type of aesthetic. This is just what I like right now. This is the sunroom in the southern region, or I guess in Australia it would be in the north. So how do we apply this? As you can tell by what I've shared, it's very much focused around new construction. However, there are some things you can do today in your existing spaces to bring some form of Vastu energy into your home. So for existing spaces, there's 3 things you can do. The first would be to do a Vastu site assessment. And this is where you would contact me and we would go through a process of looking at your existing home or business that you wanted to do an assessment on. We look at floor plans and with the address of your location, I'll be able to map out the orientation. We would do a video chat and you'd walk me through the space, and I'd have you get a specific type of laser measure and I'd walk you through how to measure out your space. And then with those numbers, specific numbers, I'll be able to run a number of calculations and be able to determine specifically what predictable qualities may be arising within your space and how vibrant it might be, if it's a new building or an old building or if it's expired. So we can see if there's any impact of the space on your life and your well-being. And then based on that, I'll provide you with a number of recommendations of how you can, adjust some of that energy in the space to create more balance and ease. And typically I don't come to you with a bunch of, huge construction requirements or removing walls and doors and windows. It's typically not that severe. It's usually a little bit more subtle. It might be switching rooms a little bit here or there, or maybe changing the way a door is opening, which hinge of the frame that it's on. Typically smaller things like that, but it really just depends. So there's a site assessment. So after the site assessment, there are a couple things you can also do to help your space. The next thing would be Vastu music. So there's certain traditional Karnataka musicians who have been trained to carry the very specific measure and rhythm of Vastu, and it creates the Vastu effect from the frequency of their sounds. Not all Karnataka music does this, it's very specific. So I can send you more specifically which musicians do that, and I have a playlist I can send you as well. It's definitely traditional music, so it's not everyone's cup of tea, but what's recommended is you have it on a low volume, on like a 24-hour loop on a small speaker somewhere. And I would recommend like where in your space you would play it to have a beneficial effect. So there's that, you can play that Vastu music, and it's really amazing. There was dear friends of mine in New York who had this amazing Ayurvedic restaurant. I did a Vastu site assessment for them a year and a half ago, and their finances weren't quite in the best place. They're doing pretty good, and I gave them a few recommendations, and they started implementing them, including this Vastu music. And immediately, as they started playing it the next day, their finances just started increasing, and now they're just booming and thriving. And obviously, things are tough for a lot of businesses during Corona times, but regardless, they're doing pretty well. So that's pretty cool. And then the other thing would be a tabletop temple. This creates a very subtle, small amount of Vastu energy within your space. I have 2 of these. One I built from scratch 3 summers ago. It was my first one. I'll actually see if I can show it to you on video here. This is one I built a few summers ago, and it was custom built with a specific measure that matches the frequency of my Atman. And I keep it in my bedroom and with the right orientation, and it has a really lovely energetic effect. And you develop a relationship with it. It's this beautiful little temple that you have with you, and the adoration of it enlivens the energy. We also have a colleague of mine has figured out how to manufacture these other temples you see pictured here. They're tabletop and they come in different sizes. And we do a couple calculations to determine which one is going to be best for you. and it's based off of your birth chart. There's a specific thing we look at, which is the Nama Nakshatra, which is like your lunar sign in Vedic astrology. And so that's the predictor of the measure of this particular frequency of your Atman that we match with for the temple. And they're really amazing. I just got the largest one for my house. I live with 8 people in this wonderful co-living house in San Francisco, and it matches all of us. And we got it earlier this week and did a little ceremony yesterday to invoke the energy, and already it's feeling really good in our house. So yeah, highly recommend these. And beyond that, you know, I want to take it a step further. You know, what can we do in the future down the road? Not just individually, but collectively. So really, Vastu can be done in any scale. So the smallest really would be a mini tabletop temple, which I just showed. And then we can start bringing the scale a little bit larger. Garden meditation temples are amazing if you have the resources and land to build one, you know, maybe in your backyard. And you like to meditate. It's amazing meditating in one of these. You can actually, many times I'll meditate in one of these garden meditation temples called a Dhyana Garbha. And you can actually, as the mind settles, you can start perceiving the frequency of the sound. It's very specific. Creative studios, guest house, cottages. You can see all these examples here as we go up in scale. And the vision I want to bring forth and invite you into is retreat centers and eco-villages to rethink, you know, how we're living all together as a society and how Vastu can help support that. So an eco-village and retreat center, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but doesn't everybody want to like live at a retreat center? I literally hear it all the time for years. Like everybody wants to build a retreat center, right? And there's a reason for it. It's because we're seeking that source of fulfillment. And Vastu brings that to life, literally that heaven on earth frequency into space. And so when we use Vastu as the foundation of creating whatever culture we want and whatever community we want, it begins to uplift everyone and supports everybody. And so we want to, you know, obviously make it earth-centered so that it's regenerative and we're not, you know, continuously stripping away from the earth and contributing to this global warming. But we can also, you know, adapt it to whatever the community culture is. So I'm looking to partner with different people, you know, around the world who want to come together and create something. And then obviously looking at regenerative building materials and integrating permaculture into the whole landscape as well, so that our food systems are super efficient and regenerative. So this is a aesthetic of and feel for what it is that we want to create through well design and yeah, just to give you a taste, to plant a seed. You know, we would have in the space a main center, we'd have, you know, a yoga meditation hall, creative workspaces, potentially a spa. Everything would be designed for easy mobility, walking and biking, permaculture gardens, cooking and farming classes. The whole thing is fully self-sufficient on its own, but not insulated, right? It's all about having people come and go and enjoy the space and become educated so they can bring what they're learning to their communities and open source all of that. You know, availability for long-term and short-term stays, and really focusing on, you know, practical and scientific deliverables in addition to implementing this spiritual knowledge, you know, like looking at how we address all 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, you know, the 17 SDGs, and then just spiritually, how do we normalize enlightenment for the masses, for everybody, right? Not just for a select few. So these are the things that we're looking at and considering, and sort of all rooted and centered in Vastu, and how Vastu can really help change the world in a positive way. And we need you to participate in it. So with that, I would love to hear your questions. What landed for you? What are you curious to learn more about? Feel free to unmute and ask away.
So Hunter, I have a quick question. So are you saying that these ancient structures, Machu Picchu, the pyramids and the Taj, they've existed for as long as they have because they have followed these Vastu principles?
Partly, and partly it's the scale and the materials as well, right? When things are made out of stone, they last a lot longer. And the Vastu energy can last more than 1,000 years if it's done properly. So yes, but you know, if you visit a lot of these sites, they're not quite as intact as they once used to be, so they're not quite as vibrant. But yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you did, thank you. Can I ask another question?
Yeah, go for it, please.
So we've talked a lot about building materials, and you've mentioned, you know, don't use steel because it kind of like traps energy, like concrete. So I come from a country where our houses are built with concrete and steel. So I think while they could get rid of the steel, like, what is the energy surrounding concrete?
You can use concrete. Concrete works beautifully. It's not always the most eco-friendly, depending on the type of concrete,
right?
But it is possible. Yeah. Yeah, so in that case, you know, if you're building larger structures that need that type of steel reinforcement, then you would use an alternative like basalt rebar.
Got it.
Are the roofs always peaked on all the buildings?
No, you can. It's possible to do a flat roof as well. There's variability in different roof slopes depending on really the aesthetic of the design.
And then I have another question, and maybe it's because you just showed us a very specific home. So, and there's not a lot of examples out there for what Vastu design looks like in a private home. But I noticed that the kitchen was kind of like in its own room and cut off from the rest of the house in terms of like it was in its own room, and then there was a dining table outside. Is that always the case, or was it just a design for that specific home?
That was the design for that specific home. It's possible to have a more open kitchen, which is certainly a more popular design in today's world, to have that kind of open living space. And you can definitely do that in Vastu. It just happened to be that particular design. And I'm sure in my next presentation, I'll have more of a variety of designs to show that, but I thank you for asking.
What about the tactility of the materials that you would use inside on furniture, rugs, and would that be all natural fibers, or how?
I mean, generally, yeah, but it's not, I wouldn't say that's.
I mean, I noticed on the sofa that you're sitting on, you have some matte finishes and then you have shiny finishes. Is it a combination of the energy between the different materials, or is it owner's choice or whatever? Is there a?
Yeah, so when it comes to like the furniture, interior design and decorating portion, it's not quite as, it's considered, but it's not quite as significant, because when you design the building itself with the right mathematics, it overrides a lot of things you might put into the space, depending on where you're putting it. So the material part has an effect, but I would say the driving factor behind the material choice is going to be focused probably around cost and your drive for sustainability.
Okay, so more sustainable materials always.
Yeah, always, for sure. I mean, if you think about it, like when this knowledge originated, there were only those options available. So yeah, You know, we don't really see specifically texts in the Vastu Shastras about, you know, can you use synthetic fibers, because that didn't exist at that point in time. So I can't imagine it would have, you know, a detrimental effect on the Vastu energy at all if you had, you know, a polyester couch. But just in terms of like the general well-being of the planet, you know, if you can afford something that's a bit more sustainable, then obviously it's probably the better route to go.
Yeah.
Hey, and
questions? Yes.
Yeah. Thanks for your time. Just curious, have you had much interaction when designing places in terms of building biology and like looking at things like, you know, off-gassing in materials and volatile organic compounds and like the way the materials that you're using versus like, I guess what I'm trying to ask is Vastu principles like congruent with building biology and the way that you're trying to avoid mold and like using hempcrete and also like fireproof and like trying to design your house in relation to what's outside in terms of the vegetation surrounding the house and all that sort of aspects?
Definitely. We see a lot of those principles just naturally coming up in the Vastu process, based on material selection, as well as there have been some studies that have shown that building Vastu helps you to avoid fires. And one could argue that maybe it's the energy, but it's also in the design itself, because in a Vastu design, you're not going to have a bunch of trees immediately around the house, because trees carry energy. And so you want to make sure that the grids of the house are laid out in such a way that the energy from the tree isn't blocking it. And so generally there's more open space around the building. At the same time, you can also apply Vastu to tighter quarters, like within a neighborhood. If you have a tiny plot of land, it is possible to, depending on the orientation, to fit a building on a smaller grid as well. So, you know, it just depends on the circumstance. But yes, there's a lot of those building biology principles do come into alignment with Vastu. Yeah.
Cool, thanks, mate. And just quickly as well, so if you're sort of doing research on potential property and looking at, you know, obviously, I think building would probably be ideal over trying to renovate an existing place, especially, you know, obviously, the obvious example is you can't change the aspect or whatnot. But if you were looking at sort of building versus buying and for lack of a better term at the moment, renovating to a more Vastu style, would you engage someone like yourself? And obviously being here in Australia, if you're looking to buy and sort of renovate, is that something you could do remotely in terms of like sending you like a floor plan and the details and the materials, or is it something you'd probably want to engage someone to actually come to site and look at?
Great question. Yeah, so when you're getting serious about a building project, we can start a series of the pre-design requirements virtually. And then at some point, depending on what we discover, it would be recommended at some point to visit the site as well. Yeah, so it depends where you're at in the process and what you're really looking to do. And then if you get really serious about Vastu, then at some point I would come and live on site for a period of time to facilitate and consult the building project to make sure that the measure and everything is done properly. And so, yeah, it's a full-on thing, and it's incredible and super rewarding, and the whole process is just very fulfilling. But yeah, it's not just, you know, a couple of things you kind of check off, but it has to be, you're birthing this energy, right? So I'm kind of like the doula in a way, just making sure everything's going well and that the birth is like proper, and I'm there, you know, from the beginning to the end.
Cool. Well, maybe we'll have to get you out here one day.
I would love it. Some of my dearest friends are Australian, and I have still yet to visit that country. So one of these days.
Cool. Thanks for your time.
Yes, thank you, Greg, for joining.
So Hunter, I have a question again about this. It's about, like, I know you showed us a very simple layout in the 8x8 grid, but does it always have to be that the Vastu structures go up? How broad can they get?
How wide can they get?
Yes.
As wide as you want.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. Mm-hmm.
And in that case, do you go move beyond the 8x8 and start going into the 9x9?
The difference between the 8x8 and the 9x9 depends on the type of structure. So the 8x8 is reserved for temples and dhyana garbhas, which are those mini meditation temples that you might build, in a backyard for your meditation. The 9x9 is for homes and businesses, and it's much easier to live in a 9x9. An 8x8 is almost like too potent, which is why it's reserved for temples and meditation spaces, so that you're visiting it here and again and not actually living in it all the time. So it helps to create better balance in our lives, the 9x9.
And if you're doing this commercially, if you're going to do some kind of meditation center or wellness center, would you then be going with a 9x9 versus an 8x8 because of the potency of an 8x8?
You would do maybe a little bit of both.
Okay.
Depending on it. So the living structures would be the 9x9. And then you might also do a Dhyana Garbha meditation temple, which would be the 8x8.
Got it.
Yeah.
Hi, I have a question. Is it possible to incorporate the Vastu architecture within tiny houses, whether they're sort of able to be mobile, or does that kind of take away from the aspect of obviously being on one land and working with that energy?
Very good question. Yeah, unfortunately, when it becomes mobile, it sort of changes it a bit. I think there is a way to make it work, because there are Vastu texts around moving vehicles. So I haven't dived into that aspect of Vastu yet, but I'm sure there must be a way. I would have to look into it for you. But yeah, because
architecturally
is moving, you would really want to make sure that it's on the proper land and that it's, got the right orientation, because otherwise you're not actually harnessing that earth energy properly.
Okay. But even architecturally, if it's a small space, a smaller space than maybe what the general 9x9 would be, can you sort of make it smaller?
You can shrink the 9x9. The 9x9 is like a custom measure depending on square footage requirements and also your Nama Nakshatra calculations. Yeah, so it's a specific measurement that is determined in the designing process based on those requirements.
Oh, okay. So everyone has a different
measure. Exactly.
Oh, okay. Cool. Thank you.
And some measures are compatible for multiple people. So there's a set number of them, like a template of them. And we can pick between them depending on a variety of different requirements.
Okay, so it's not necessarily sort of a square shape?
No, it can be elongated. It's possible to have it make it more rectangular. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Hunter, can you walk us through what going into someone's space, or you kind of did, but would you need floor plans and of existing spaces? How does that work?
To do a Vastu site assessment of an existing space? Yeah. So what I would need is floor plans of the existing space and the address, so I can look at the orientation on the earth grid and the slope of the land. And then also we would just, have a little interview call, and I'd tour the space and ask questions that have come up in looking at the floor plans and orientation. And then we would together do interior measurements. So I'd call out specifically where I'd want some measurements taken, and I have a specific laser measure that you can order online, and we would take a few of those measures. And once I get those numbers, then I run a number of calculations to determine what qualities are rising in that space and how potent they might be. And then based on that, I would come up with a variety of recommendations of how you might shift things in a simple, affordable, practical way to maybe minimize any undesirable qualities and to bring in some more beneficial Vastu energy into the space, which typically includes the tabletop temple and the Vastu music.
Okay.
Basically, even if you live in an apartment in New York City where you don't have a lot of agency in terms of making changes to the space, there's still benefits to doing a consultation with you.
Yes, I mean, it just provides insight to what's going on in the space. And then in terms of adjusting any energy in the space or creating some benefit, if you really can't do anything, then at least you can play the music, and that can be done pretty much at any point immediately. You just ask me for the playlist, I'll send it to you. And then the tabletop temple is what really also creates a really positive, beneficial energy. Yeah. You guys are asking great questions. Anyone else want to ask something? If you're thinking it, probably other people are too.
Hi, Hunter. Thank you so much for taking the time to walk us through this. I'd heard so much about it, but this was so detailed and informative. So very appreciated.
Welcome.
It was interesting in the beginning. You'd mentioned that for a long time, the Vastu technology was concealed because it could be, I guess, misused, which is a very new concept that I had not heard of before. But I guess my question was, outside of India, where have you seen more adoption of Vastu architecture? And like, have you seen any communities or countries that use it more? And maybe like, what are some common traits that make people fascinated by it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so the knowledge was concealed because of its effectiveness and its power to control or harm people. They didn't want it to get into the wrong hands, because you can actually intentionally adjust the measurement to impact people in not a positive way, right? So we don't want that. But because of that, unfortunately, a lot of what we see in the world in terms of Vastu is very much piecemealed and not complete. And that in itself has created harm for people. And I know people directly that it has done that too. Like totally up-leveling someone's life just out of nowhere when they change their space a little bit, open up the center of your existing house. Don't recommend doing that. Or putting fountains in the Brahmastan, or creating oversimplified rules that aren't really based in the Shastric text, just based off of someone's idea. So part of my job is to help educate people, to inform them, of what the more traditional knowledge is. And then in terms of the application of it, other than some temples and homes in India and parts of the US and Europe, most of it right now is still somewhat private, except for the temples. So we still have to bring this about into the world in a bigger way for more people to directly experience this. And that's a part of my mission. There are some communities that are doing it, but they're not really doing it the right way. And I know people who've lived in these places that have reported not so good experiences. So I don't even want to call them out specifically, but I'll just say that. There's a big one in Iowa. I'll just say that. You can do your own research. So yes. At the end of the day, I think everyone's trying to do good and make things work, but it's we want to make sure we're doing things the right way. And when we look at all of the texts and everything that I shared with you, double checking the archaeological sites and testing it out directly through our own experience, then we start to really know this on a deeper level. And now we're ready. You know, in the next 5 to 10 years, is my intention, my mission is to make this big and really impactful for people. So yeah, so the invitation is for you to get involved in some way if you find it fascinating.
Thank you.
Hey, Hunter.
Hey, Georgia.
Hi from New Zealand.
Hi there.
Thank you so much for sharing this today. It's really amazing.
My pleasure.
Yeah, it gave me chills when you were talking about nature's response. I just felt like my whole heart open, so I can really feel that there's a need for that and the calling which you're responding to, which is really cool.
Georgia, your volume is a little low. Do you mind speaking up a bit?
I'll turn it up. Can you hear me?
That's better. Thank you.
Did you catch what I said, or do you want me to?
Yes, I did.
Okay, good. And I was just wondering about the mini tabletop temples. What information do you need to get those organized, and how do we go about that if we're interested?
Yeah, so if you're interested in a tabletop temple, send me an email and your birth information, and I will let you know which of the 3 temples are compatible for you. If you live with other people, I'll need their birth information as well, so that it's compatible for everyone in the house. And then one of those 3 sizes should work, hopefully. Somehow I was able to find 2 sizes that worked for 8 people in my house, so it's possible. And then based on that, you know, I'll let you know what the dimensions are, so that and the orientation that it should be in, so that you have an idea of where you might place it in your home. And I could offer some suggestions as well. And so we figure that out. And then once you feel like, you know, you're ready to make it happen, then, you know, I'll connect you with my colleague to place the order with, and she'll ship it to you directly. And it comes unassembled, and you assemble it, and everything's made with incredible precision within a 64th of an inch. It's super easy to put together. I put it together in like 10 minutes. Everything fits together nicely. Don't even have to apply any glue or nails. And then you're good to go.
Awesome.
Hunter, it's Steph.
Hey, Steph.
How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, sorry I was a little bit late. So sorry if you covered this at the start, but I'm wondering, being at the mercy of the rental market, when you're looking for a new property, is there, I mean, it's hard enough as it is to find something that's sort of harmonious, but is there sort of like one main thing that you would be looking for when you're looking for a rental property, or like a checklist, like the most important thing that you'd be sort of trying to keep in mind?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, it's hard to say because everything depends, and you're not really going to know unless you take measurements of the space, and that can be very impractical, you know, unless you're trained in this. So part of it is your state of consciousness is actually going to attract you to a building or place that's in alignment with your state of consciousness. And so, you know, as a meditator and as a teacher, you know, you can lean into your intuition. So there's that part of it. We don't want to get too much in our heads about it, because sometimes the overanalysis of it can be a little much. So that would be the first thing I would say. And then there are a couple things you could pay attention to that you would probably want to avoid. One would be new construction, like a brand new building that's not Vastu compliant is going to be a lot more potent in whatever energy it is, because it's a new building. So looking at older buildings, like that have been around for over 100 years, probably don't have much energetic effect at all. And so you're probably better off living in a space that isn't going to impact you either in an undesirable way or a desirable way. So that would be one thing. And I don't know if anyone else has noticed that, like, new construction feels off sometimes, whereas when you're in an older building, it's like a little bit nicer. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is there's something called Agnya Prachi, which is when the entrance on the east side is tilted a little bit more to the south. And when the entrance is slightly tilted to the south from the east, it activates generally more of that fire element, which can create a little bit of an imbalance that's not really desirable. So that would be something to pay attention to. But again, it's not in every case. It really depends. What would be another example? If you have a building, a residence, and it's on the grid, like you look at a Google map and it's like not tilted, but like very much square. And there's a southern entrance to the building and it's perfectly in the middle, not tilted to one side, but perfectly in the middle. And it's a residence, I would avoid that altogether. If it's for business, do it. South Central business is okay, but not for residential. If the door is slightly to the east from the center, then you might be okay.
So, and why is that? Why would it be prosperous for business but not good for residential?
It's because of the quality that resides in that central pada called yama. And passing through yama is actually good for business, but not good for residents. That's
Right.
just the general answer, yeah.
That's
It
really
also
helpful.
depends on the measure of the space. So again, follow your intuition for now. And and you can also ask me specific questions. Like if you're looking and, you know, you're not in a rush to find something and you have some time, you know, to get my feedback, just reach out to me and I'm happy to help you.
All right, awesome. Thank you.
Hunter, one last question, because I know
Yes,
we're
Ariana.
is there's something that we've spoken about before about Vastu needing flat land and not anything that's hilly. Can you expand on that just a little bit?
So different angles of slope cause different energies to rise in the Vastu space. Some of them desirable, some of them undesirable. So we want to make sure that the slope of the land is going to benefit us in the way we want. So we look at specific slopes, and we also, if there is a subtle slope on the land, we do some flattening out of it regardless. Because we want that slab and that grid to be balanced in all padas of the 9x9. And if it's sloped, it creates more energetic qualities in one side and not the other, right? So we want to make it so it's more flat, which of course, you know, and for those of us who live in very, you know, hilly places like where I grew up, it very much limits the places where you can actually build Vastu. But that's just how it is, you know. That's, you know, if we're really following the principles and want the proper effect, we just have to get more creative and look at it as a fun challenge rather than feeling like it's a rigid limitation. And then, you know, you'll be guided in the right way and you'll find the right place. Good question. Hope that answered it. We're a little over time. Are there any last questions? Thank you all for joining. This was such a pleasure sharing this with you, and thank you for taking the time to listen to all of this. And yeah, I hope you got something valuable out of it. And please reach out if you have any other questions, or if you're looking at new spaces or want to get a tabletop temple. I'll see if I can get you that Vastu music link as well. Maybe I'll do a follow-up with that. And yes, I look forward to hopefully connecting with you all again another time.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Hunter.
you so much, Hunter.
You're welcome. Take care. Have a wonderful Sunday or Monday, wherever you're located, and be in touch.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.